Liam, thanks. Now to a story that's gained national attention and we are following very closely. The search for Easthampton school superintendent is back on after the latest candidate to be offered the job has now withdrawn her name from the race. Western Mass News reporter Paris Dunford now joins us live with the details. Paris?
Matt, we've confirmed that the woman who accepted the position last week has now changed her mind. We've also learned that the person who was originally offered the job, Dr. Vito Perrone, would still be considering that position. After rallies and an outpour of support from the community, Dr. Vito Perrone has now said he would be open to conversations regarding an offer to be the Easthampton school superintendent. Dr. Perrone told Western Mass News his offer was rescinded about 2 weeks ago because he referred to the Easthampton School Committee chairperson and executive assistant as ladies, which he was told was taken as a microaggression. This past Monday, the school committee held an open meeting where they officially voted to rescind Dr. Perrone's offer and to offer the job pending negotiations to Ludlow Director of Curriculum Instruction, Dr. Erica Faginski-Stark. However, Western Mass News has learned that she withdrew her name from consideration. But Dr. Perrone is still interested in this position?
Yes. Dr. Perrone remains interested.
We sat down with James Winston, the attorney representing Perrone. He tells us that Dr. Perrone would still be willing to consider an offer if the committee voted to reinstate it.
He was the principal of Easthampton High School. He cares very deeply about the students in the Easthampton School District, the teachers in that school district, the community of Easthampton, which he considers home. So, yes, if there was a path, if there was a window of opportunity where this ultimately leads him to have that offer reinstated.
Winston says he and Dr. Perrone were hoping to slow down the committee selection process until more conversations were held. But now that the search for a superintendent is back open again, they are hoping both parties can have a conversation.
While both sides may have perhaps some hurt feelings, hopefully there's that path where both parties can work past that and reach a mutually beneficial agreement.
Now, we've reached out to several school committee members and the mayor about the situation, but have not yet heard back. The school committee is expected to discuss the superintendent search at their next meeting, which is scheduled for Tuesday, April 25th. Reporting live in Easthampton, Paris Dunford for Western Mass News.